To today's meeting. I know that obviously people are beginning to join us, but rather than delay the start of the meeting, I think we'll push on now. So obviously this is the November meeting of the Governance and Audit Committee. We actually had to abandon, unfortunately, our October meeting due to significant IT problems. So matters from that meeting agenda have been brought forward into today's meeting. So welcome to everybody. I'd particularly like to say a welcome to a number of individuals. With me in the chamber today, I'd like to say welcome to Steph Payne, who's the new audit manager, who's now been in post for 3 months, and we will be hearing from Steph later. So welcome, Steph. Looking forward to working with you. Also want to say a big welcome to Councillor Lodwick, who is present with us today. This is his first proper meeting, obviously because the October meeting had to be abandoned, and to Councillor Clement Williams, who had previously been a member of this committee and has now rejoined us. Obviously, you're aware the meeting will be recorded. Mobile phones have to be switched off, and the usual thing about raising your hand if you have any questions. So moving on, I have no other announcements other than the fact we have we're currently carrying a lay member vacancy. The interview for that post is going to take place on the 6th of December, which means that we have meetings in January and February. So hopefully, if that interview process is successful, the new lay member will be joining us for those events. I also want to say that my Vice Chair, Mark Owen, is with me in the chamber, so we are obviously totally quorate. Next item on the agenda is declarations of interest. I don't have a declaration of interest, but I don't know if anybody else does. Don't see any, Chair. No hands showing. So consequently, we'll move on to the third item on the agenda, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. I only have one point to note, and that was that at the start of the minutes, both myself and Mark Owen are referred to as councillors, whereas obviously we are lay members. So I don't know if anybody has any other point they want to raise. If not, I will need a proposer and seconder.
I'm happy to propose,
I'll propose, and maybe Councillor Henton, I can see you put your microphone on. Maybe you can second.
Yeah, happy to second, Chair.
There we are, in which case we accept the minutes as a true record. And moving on, the next agenda item is the forward work programme, which is for information only. Does anyone have any points they want to raise? In which case we'll move on to agenda item 5. Sorry, we are going to reverse agenda items 5 and 6. So we'll deal with agenda item 6 first, which is the Audit Wales closure of accounts, which run from pages 211 to pages 242. And I can see that Michelle Phoenix from Audit Wales is with us on the screen. So maybe, Michelle, if you wouldn't mind introducing this particular item for us.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can all hear me. So this is the report following completion of our audit. If I can just give you a brief overview. We do intend to issue an unqualified audit opinion once we've received the signed letter of representation from yourselves, a draft of which is included in Appendix 2 of the document. So looking into what occurred during the audit, we identified 2 further risks during the audit that we are required to report to you. Firstly, around internal recharges that have been made in the year, we identified a net credit balance of 40 million, where we would expect them to net off to nil within the accounts. Now, considerable work was undertaken by Hugh's finance team during our audit, and we were able to conclude that the accounts were correctly stated. We have made a recommendation for the council to review the relevant policies and procedures to ensure staff follow the correct approach going forward. The second risk we identified during the audit was a risk around the classification of surplus assets. Our initial testing found that an asset had been duplicated and was in both surplus assets and in other land and buildings. We did identify some further errors, and as noted later on in our report, we have recommended the council review the remaining balance during 2024-25. So moving on, there are two errors that have not been amended. These are not material and do not impact on our audit opinion. These have been included in the letter of representation, and management have agreed to amend these in 24-25. There have been some changes to the accounts following our audit. These are detailed in Appendix 3 and relate mainly to the issues we identified within Note 11 of the account Property, Plant and Equipment. So the amendment have increased the reported deficit and reduced the balance sheet assets by 1.383 million. And then you will see that we've also included references to further matters within our report around the derecognition of capital expenditure and also assets with nil net book value assets. And the council has agreed to act on our recommendations. Can I just take this opportunity to say that Hugh and his finance team worked really well with us. They responded to all our queries really quickly, even though we were raising some issues with them. So can I just put it on record that they've been very helpful, and thank you for working with us so well during the audit. And that's it. I'm happy to take any questions on any matters in the report.
Thank you very much. I do note, and it applies to agenda item 6 and agenda item 5 on pages 103, 104 and 228, where it's referring to the letter. The name of the local authority is actually missing from those particular pages. Obviously, Neath Talbot County Borough Council will need to be added. Colleagues, I don't know if any of you've got any questions you want to ask of Michelle Phoenix. No. Obviously, this particular closure of accounts is very important. It's very welcome that we, Neath Talbot Council, are going to be receiving an unqualified audit report. And obviously, we note the points that have been raised with us. It's important, however, that, and it's covered on page 235, there's a statement which is headed Representations by the Governance and Audit Committee. And I think it's important that we actually acknowledge it, and I'll read it out. We acknowledge that the representations made by management above have been discussed with us. We acknowledge our responsibility for the preparation of true and fair financial statements in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. The financial statements will be approved, or rather have been approved by Neath Talbot County Borough Council in October. We confirm that we have taken all the steps that we ought to have taken in order to make ourselves aware of any relevant audit information and to establish that it has been communicated to you. We confirm that as far as we are aware, there is no relevant audit information of which you are unaware. So that's an important point. So if anybody else has no questions, obviously this report is for information and therefore it is to be noted. So does anyone want to add anything at this stage? No. In which case we note the report and we'll move back into the papers to the closure of accounts section, which runs from pages 13 to 210. And I believe, Hugh, you're going to introduce it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, so this is just our response in terms of what Michelle has outlined. Very pleased again to receive an unqualified audit opinion, very important in terms of the Council's overall governance arrangements. Taking on board what Michelle said, happy to note the observations, and we will be looking to put improved processes and procedures in place our end to make sure that some of those things that they found don't occur again. And again, reciprocally, just to put on record my thanks to Michelle and her team for the way that they've engaged with officers of the council. Very much appreciated. Doesn't happen everywhere across Wales. And also just on record, my thanks to my team, Diane, Ross and Louise in the chamber today for all the work they put in and their teams in terms of preparing the accounts. So that's all from me. Thank you. Diolch, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know if any members have any questions. In which case, no questions. Obviously, there are 4 recommendations that can be found on page 16. We need to approve the letter of representation, which is included in Appendix 1, approve the final 2023-24 statements of accounts as included in Appendix 2, note the annual governance statement, which is shown at Appendix 3, and we need to give me authorisation as chair of the Governance and Audit Committee that I may attach my electronic signature to both the letter of representation and the statement of accounts. So I will need a proposer and seconder for that set of recommendations.
To propose.
Thank you, Councillor Grimshaw.
Happy to second, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Clement Williams. In which case, we accept that decision, and the actions will be carried out as soon as possible. The closure of accounts has to take place today to make sure that everything is done within the appropriate time frame. So thank you very much indeed. The next item on the agenda is agenda item 7, the Audit Wales programme and timetable Q2 update April to September 2024. And I believe, Noel, you're going to be introducing this.
Thank you, Chair. This is a standing item on the agenda, and it is the timetable for Audit Wales's work. Q2 has been superseded. We did have on the agenda at the last meeting, which was delayed. The Q1 update. This is just literally a list of works that's been undertaken and has been pulled through our governance and audit processes. So I'm not sure if there's any questions on this. It is merely here for information.
Does anyone have any questions? No hands showing. I suppose my main question for us as a Governance and Audit Committee is whether this particular agenda item raises any questions or issues for Neath Talbot Council, not necessarily for answer today, but maybe the next time we see this particular report coming to us, it's something that should be covered as a standard. So we're just able to identify the key points, certainly for this particular County Borough Council.
Of course, yes, noted, Chair. Thank you.
I did note when I went through the papers that there was an acronym on page 256, AOLE, yeah, which we eventually found out meant areas of learning and experience.
That's it, yes.
And I also note that on page 262, there was a reference to a biennial report entitled National Fraud Initiative with a date of October 2024. And I suppose it's a question of the status of that report.
I have checked, Chair. The report has now been published by Audit Wales, and I can ask Nadine to circulate it with the minutes of this meeting.
Thank you very much, because I know that national fraud initiatives, counter fraud and things are going to be issues that are important to all organisations, but are things that we as a Governance and Audit Committee will want to be looking at in greater detail in the future. So any other questions following that later discussion, colleagues? If not, obviously this matter agenda item is here for information. So we note the report, especially the details contained in Appendix 1. Moving on, we've got the corporate risk management arrangements, a document that runs from page 267 onwards. It's a new formatting of information that we've previously received. Some welcome changes in the formatting, but I think we potentially will work on the basis it's work in progress. So I'd like to hear from officers to explain the changes, please.
Diolch, Cadeirydd. So yes, there's been some significant improvements made to the Strategic Risk Register since it was last presented to the Governance and Audit Committee, not least just the presentation of the Strategic Risk Register, which was often highlighted by yourselves as a committee, as the previous version was on an Excel sheet, very difficult for you to view on your iPads, etc. So we've moved to make it far more presentable in that regard. If I could just cover the other areas that we've looked to strengthen over the last number of months as well with regards to the way we operate as a corporate directors group. So what you'll note is that we have also put in place now a risk appetite. This didn't exist before. The reason the risk appetite is important is that it helps us and guides us in terms of how we view risks we take in terms of the services that we deliver. This was a piece of work that the Corporate Directors Group undertook back towards the end of the summer of this year. It is work in progress, so it is very much based on the principles and concepts from the government's Orange Book of Risk Management. And what you have is, and I think these are on within your pack, but what you have is the risk appetite. So you have averse, minimalist, cautious, open, and eager, and there's a description of what each one of those category looks like. And then what we did in terms of the risk categories themselves, you'll see them down: strategic, governance, operations, legal, etc. And then what was our appetite as a corporate directors group with regards to those areas? And that's where we are at the moment with that piece of work. What we have to do now is ensure that our risk appetite, as stated in the risk appetite statement, aligns to the strategic risk register. And that is a piece of work that we will be looking to undertake as a directors group early in the new year, to ensure that, you know, where we say we want to be open with regards to the way we maybe approach our strategic outlook, then the risks we've got in the register need to reflect that. And that's a piece of work, as the chair rightly said, is ongoing and will take place early in the new year. So when it comes back next time, there'll be greater clarity and greater alignment in that regard. Another area we've improved upon is we've brought in what we term as inherent risk score and residual risk score. So previously, all you had against each one of the risks was whether it was red, amber, or green. So whether it was high risk, medium risk, or green being low risk. And you'd be familiar, I'm sure, with the 5x5 matrix in terms of risk of implications of the risk happening and the impact that risk has as well. So that is a subjective view, and it's a subjective score based on the expertise of the service managers who are responsible for those individual risks. The reason that risk score is important is because when you look at the high risk areas of a red, a high risk score could be 25, so that's the highest you can get in terms of a high risk score, and that would be red. But there could be a risk in there that is also previously was just red, but it could only be scoring a 12. So the conversation you would have with regards to those two risk items could be significantly different if you were aware of where we were looking at it from a risk score perspective. Clearly what we have then in terms of those inherent risks, what we've also introduced is we split what were previously only referred to as mitigating actions, and we split that into kind of mitigating actions and also now risk controls, because some of the things we have in place are actually controls we have to manage risk and limit risk. Other things then are actions that we are taking to reduce that residual risk score as well. The table that has appeared on page 305 ideally would have been in the cover sheet. I think it's on page 305. I want to say it's Appendix 3. That summarises for all the 21 risks in our strategic risk register, responsible officers, the risk category it falls into. It also gives you the inherent and residual risk, but it also tells you whether that residual risk has increased or decreased based on the mitigation actions that officers have been undertaken. So I think next time we present that in that part of the cover sheet itself. What you'll also notice within the strategic risk register, and this again is a piece of work that we'll be looking to undertake early in the new year as a strategic leadership team, the directors in the new year, we insert a table in there called the target risk source. So we've got your inherent risk, you've got your residual risk. When we look at against our risk appetite, what do we think our target risk is? So are we satisfied when the residual risk with the mitigation actions only comes out at a 9, or do we want it to be lower? And therefore, that's a conversation we need to have as directors to understand where we want to pitch that target risk score in line with our risk appetite. So, as I said, there's a significant amount of work taking place to strengthen and ensure that we have a very robust approach to our strategic risk register. It's certainly strengthened the discussions and conversations that we've had as a directors group, and it is an evolving process. We will continue to improve and strengthen how we present that and the scrutiny and the due diligence that we give it as officers. But happy to take any questions from yourselves as a committee. Diolch, Cadeirydd.
I mean, certainly it's a welcome development. The progress is notable. I mean, the spreadsheets which we were getting at one point were wholly unwieldy and impossible to read. I know I've got some observations, and they're me speaking as a critical friend purely and simply because it is work in progress, and I'm fairly sure others will have some comments. And I go through them as I've drafted them. On page 269, which is SR 21, which relates to hotel accommodation, there's reference at the end of the main paragraph to the possibility of there being a legal challenge. It's on the basis of if this happens, then X will or might happen. I suppose I'm interested to know who the legal challenge would be from. I don't know whether that's a question that could be answered today or we can come back to. Officers are just going to find the relevant page.
Thank you, Chair. So I can just come in and probably can clarify that. So some of the things that we've been looking at from a planning perspective is how you ultimately balance some of the planning obligations in respect of hotel accommodation against the overwhelming need at present to provide that temporary accommodation because of the additional new responsibilities that are placed on local authorities from Welsh Government. So what we are concerned about and what we are making sure that we are mitigating against and putting appropriate systems in place is if there was a challenge maybe where temporary accommodation is being used and maybe some of the appropriate planning elements haven't been complied with, where we've used what we call permitted development rights, there'll be some opportunities for us to be able to clarify and address that. So the type of individuals who could make challenges there are probably individuals maybe who are unhappy about the use of certain accommodation in localities being used for hotel accommodation for housing and meeting the council's statutory homelessness duties.
Thank you very much indeed. I know that this is a document which is going to come to us for review on a 6 monthly basis. So obviously it's going to develop over time. On page 277, there's a at the bottom right, I think it is, there's a little box that has been ticked. I think it's the only one that has been ticked. And I'm just interested to know why that one has been ticked, and it relates to has there been any change in risk rating since last report?
Thank you, Chair. So yes, I mentioned that table 3 or the appendix 3 indicates graphically whether the residual risk has reduced or whether it's stayed the same. What that box indicates is whether the risk rating has changed since the last report. I accept from that particular box, you don't know whether it's decreased or not. So that's something we can strengthen in terms of a visual for you, Chair. Diolch.
Thank you. Because it's important not to have to cross-reference back and forth because we're going to miss pages. Councillor Clement Williams, I can see your hands raised. So perhaps if you can take your point now.
Yeah, thanks. With the ALN, it's the one after the SR21 that you mentioned, SR22, with the additional learning needs. It's saying that if we don't fulfil the statutory duties, how do we mitigate against not providing it? Because we lost a chunk of that because of the school not being built in Pontardawe. I was just wondering, what's been put in place to fill that gap.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. What I would say is that we don't have that level of understanding and knowledge with regards to the individual risks. Those scrutiny committees where they are as relevant, this strategic risk register goes to the scrutiny committees, and those risks will get scrutinised in detail. Then those questions could be asked at that scrutiny committee. I think for yourselves as members of this committee is to seek assurances that we have the appropriate arrangements in place as a local authority to manage risks. Diolch.
Thank you. I note obviously that some of the formatting is work in progress. They sort of become rather messy. One page runs into another. For example, page 277 and 278. There are also some areas where the risk control section is blank. I know obviously they're going to be populated over time. I know that certainly when I was looking at it, and Noel, when you mentioned target risks, obviously those aren't populated at the moment. I suppose I'd like to understand when that's likely to happen and how that's going to be informed. And also you mentioned risk appetite, the open, cautious and minimalist information. I actually think it would be important somewhere in the document to highlight what those explanations are. I know you were talking about the Orange Book of Risk Management, but it would help me. Certainly, I understand what risk appetites are from a financial investment perspective, but how would they actually relate here? So those are comments about, future reports coming back.
Diolch, Cadeirydd. So just in terms of your last point there, on page 273 of the pack, we have given a description of what each one of those risk appetites is. So for adverse, you have the description there in terms of the description given there. Again, we've taken that from the government's Orange Book on management risk principles and concepts. So that's not our definition or our description. It's what's come as principles and concepts and best practice in that relationship. And in terms of the target risk score, I do think it's important that, when you look at, if you take a particular strategic risk, for example, when you look at what the inherent risk score is and the residual risk score is, and you look at the mitigating actions and you see that most of them, if not all of them, maybe are complete, are we satisfied as an organisation that the residual risk score is low enough? Okay, does it match up against what our risk appetite is? If we feel it is, then fine, we don't need to do anything. If we feel that the residual risk really should be lower than it is and all the mitigating actions are complete, for example, we might challenge the officers responsible to say, well, what else could you be doing to minimise that risk? Because we've set the target risk score as a 6, whereas at present it's a 9. I think that's really important. It kind of that will align us then to our risk appetite. I think it'll give yourselves as a committee an indication as to whether we're actually moving in the right direction with regards to that residual risk, and whether we are putting the right mitigating actions in place. There'll be some in our strategic risk register where, the residual risk is what it is, and we've completed most of the mitigation actions, but we are comfortable with where it sits in terms of its residual risk. So that's the work that we will be doing. I can't give you an answer now because we haven't debated and discussed that as a strategic leadership team. But that will be something that by the next time we come back to yourselves as a committee, you will see that target risk score. And then there's a conversation as a committee as to whether you think we've got that balance right. Diolch.
Thank you, and apologies for missing the risk appetite page. Again, it comes back to when you've got weighty documents, things get sort of buried, and maybe hyperlinks that take you to, or some form of indication until we actually get to understand these better. Obviously, as I said earlier, we're going to see this every 6 months. Do any other colleagues want to raise any points?
Yes, please, Chair. Thank you, Noran. I think taking the point on target risks, totally agree. I think unless you've kind of signposted what that risk profile you're trying to get to is, then it's hard to know how far you need to run, what you do, right? So I think for a committee, it's useful to understand that, because obviously the ones which are red are kind of be the ones you'd be prioritising. If you've moved to green, it kind of almost feels like you're in a space where you're within risk appetite, I would suspect. Just on that Appendix 3, I think I'd probably suggest, and I know we've sort of had some discussion about bringing a separate session on corporate risk management, but I think for me some of the risk scores look a little off as well. So I think it's not just about moving the target risk scores into here, but if I just refer to page 307, strategic risk number 10, the financial one, the inherent risk score of this one, where if the council doesn't accurately factor in demographic profile of population into plans and financial planning, the risk of services can't respond appropriately. The inherent risk score there is only a 9. So if you do the maths on that, the probability of that would be a high, would be 5, only 5 by 5, because for those who are not aware, inherent risk score is based on, before you even factor in controls, what's the risk of this going wrong? So your inherent risk will be 5. Well, how do you get to 9 from there? So your impact has got to be at least a 3, surely. So you're going to be 15. So I think as part of this exercise, you need to recalibrate and just be comfortable at the risk scores we bring in here. I mean, just on that same risk, number 10, it isn't always going to be incorrect that your inherent risk score and your residual risk score is the same, but quite often when I see that in risk registers, it doesn't look right, because it means that the mitigating action you're taking isn't having any effect to lower your risk profile. So obviously, if you did increase that inherent risk score to 15 or 20, then obviously 9 as a residual risk looks okay. So just as a read across, it doesn't look right. On strategic risk 17, so this is on page 308. And I was plucking a couple out of here, right? And let's say there's a lot more discussion we could have on this, I think. So that one is governance and regarding schools and curricular reform. Now, my question isn't on that specific risk itself, but it's a broader issue around governance of schooling and education. So if that strategic risk is in there, just from my own awareness of what's going on in the borough with, for example, Alderman Davis, which is carrying approximately 1.5 million deficit on a school pupil roll of under 300 children. Curricular reform is important, but if you're not managing the funding side of the schooling and the education, the risk is you're not going to be able to deliver provision. The school might even close, right? So, broadening that point, Kevin Syson last year had an Eston review and had a rating of significant improvements needed. This year, Eston returned, and that has dropped to special measures. So again, you'll have improvement officers in place looking at the plans the school has put in place, obviously, to get itself back to a good position. So for me, it's trying to understand why curricular reform is in there, but not the deficit position of certain schools, which is obviously a huge risk. So I think, as I say, a lot to probably think about, and again, it's for us as a committee to be comfortable that everything we're seeing is kind of cogent and it makes sense. And I think just It's probably obviously more for education to answer some of these points, right? Appreciate it won't be yourself, but obviously it comes into your risk register here. I think a request would be as well from me that education could bring a picture of the deficits in schools across the borough, because I'm aware of certain schools which are obviously in a tight spot. And I'm aware of a comparable school in Swansea, which has got over 1,000 children, only running a 280k deficit, right? So it's for us to be comfortable that we're looking at the right things here and that we can really drive the performance in the right direction. Outside of that, obviously, Chair made a couple of points which I'd noted and I agreed with. So, yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Mark, for those comments and observations, really. And you're spot on in terms of when you looked at the 9-9 kind of scenario. I think, like I said, that scoring element is something that we've introduced this year. So I do think officers as well are getting their heads around whether they're pitching it in the right place. So there is some more work for us to do in terms of recalibrating some of those. And I don't disagree at all that is something that needs to happen in order to make sure that officers understand when we talk about that risk matrix, whether they're getting that inherent risk right, and whether they're getting their residual risk scoring right as well based on the mitigation action. So absolutely accept that as a learning point that officers and we need to better reflect that in the strategic risk register. In terms of the last observations you made, yeah, absolutely, the questions that the education department would need to pick up on. But on your broader point, in terms of those individual schools, I'd expect, because this is the strategic risk register, I'd expect the directorate risk register to contain those more broken down details on each potential school in terms of where they see those risks in that respect. But it's a fair point in terms of schools funding and schools gaps. Is that something we need to look to bring into the strategic risk register? I think that's a conversation that we could certainly have as a leadership team as to where that is a risk that needs to come into the strategic risk register. Mark, I think that's a fair valid point.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, excuse me, we did have a chat earlier in the week, kind of a pre-session running through the papers, and I think we've spoken about having a separate session on the risk management framework, how it works, because I think, again, having visibility of the risks that you just mentioned on the directorate level, how they are making their way up into the strategic or vice versa, because obviously we notice some are closed, some are dropping off. I didn't necessarily understand what the rationale for that was. But again, to your point, they may well be in the directorate risk register, but if you've not funding the school properly and you're running a huge deficit, then strategically that is a huge risk. So that why that isn't there is kind of the question. But anyway, like I say, happy to pick it up again. Thank you.
Yep, just on that school budget issue, my understanding is that there's a report going to the Education Skills and Wellbeing Scrutiny Committee in January, specifically around school funding and school budget. So it may be something that Mark we want to bring here as well for consideration, Chair.
Thank you. Very valid points. I mean, certainly this is work in progress, but the point Mark made about, if the directorate reports are reflecting a picture and it's then not translating into the strategic risk reports, it's for us to understand, because our assurances has to be based on the papers that come in front of us. But we also have to be confident that the papers that sit below these papers are also reflecting the appropriate thing. So it's about how we collectively as a committee achieve that assurance, but particularly also when you've got lay members who are within this committee who aren't seeing maybe some of the details that the councillors are seeing in their day-to-day committee structures. So that would be very important. I know this is an area, and we have been talking over recent weeks, and will continue to do so. We are going to want of a better phrase, a suite of training sessions to happen. Obviously, risk management will need to form part of that. But there's also, for example, when we are, and obviously not for this year, but in future years, when we're looking at the closure of accounts, for example, it would be helpful to have training about financial background issues, so that when we get to the meetings, we are making very informed decisions.
No, diolch, Cadeirydd. Thank you. I think I know the committee's had training in the past. My understanding was that it just didn't hit the mark in terms of achieving what we were hoping it would achieve. So we can certainly look to pencil that in as soon as we can. So for you to have an understanding of how we are approaching this, I think that's really important. So that's something, and it'd probably be best if we just delivered that rather than I think last time we tried to get somebody in and I just didn't hit the mark if I remember rightly. So we can certainly look at that and absolutely our role as a committee is to ensure that our arrangements are working, and if we do need to understand how these risks filter up into the strategic risk register and why they sometimes drop off the strategic risk register. So that is absolutely our role. Diolch, Cadeirydd.
And I think, as a committee collectively and individually, whether it's myself and Mark as vice chair or other committee members, we would be very happy to look at your, sort of work in progress between meetings if needs be, rather than wait until the next 6 months and us then potentially, because we're more attuned to things, come up with a whole raft of other suggested improvements. I mean, I, for example, noted when I read the papers that on page 281, there's reference to hybrid working being mentioned under recruitment, obviously as a means of attracting people to join the local authority, but it's not then mentioned under health and safety on page 285 when you're talking about people's working conditions. And you would expect, given that people are taking advantage of the hybrid working, from a health and safety perspective, there will be some health and safety elements within it. So it's those sort of observations which may assist you in your thought processes and developing things. Does anybody else want to mention anything? And because there's a lot also in the closure of the accounts paperwork that we spoke about earlier. There's lots of figures in there which potentially would inform strategic risk registers, and it's about the read across, understanding the financial figures so they actually fit into the strategic risk register. Does anyone else have any point that they want to mention? No? In which case, thank you very much, Nolan. Obviously generated a lot of conversation and things, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing this when it comes back. And obviously we will make sure we have to have some training about risk management between now and the 6-month period. So the next agenda item is runs from page 309 onwards. It's the progress update, use of performance information, service user perspective and outcomes. And again, Nolan, I assume, it's Louise. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this item has been brought as a request from the previous Governance and Audit meeting committee. So this report from Audit Wales was produced across each of the 22 local authorities on service user perspective, and it was brought to Governance and Audit on the 12th of July. You will notice in your pack on page 313 the appendix of the management response form that we submitted to Audit Wales with our comments. There is a final column with an update on progress against each of the recommendations. So work has been ongoing since we received this report from Audit Wales to look at where we can start embedding service user perspective across our corporate plan and our performance monitoring throughout the year. So I think you may recall from the previous meeting, we said that there were a number of pockets of service user perspective across the local authority, namely social services, the youth service, where we do get that customer voice. But I think it's about the point Audit Wales raised is about us taking that up to a senior management level and it being part of the decision-making process. So that is something that we are working on, and hopefully going forward, you will see more of that customer voice throughout our reporting and decision-making process. For recommendation 2, we are making really good progress on our cross-council working. We've introduced a strategic planning performance group where there are senior officers sitting on that group that both feed into senior management team meetings and engaging with accountable managers and performance officers. So we are bringing that golden thread right the way through officer level, from service and delivery right the way up into the decision-making process. And also this is going to be strengthening our corporate planning and performance management framework, again, which is a piece of work that is ongoing. And with the new chief exec in post now, we'll be taking her views into consideration. And then lastly, around the accuracy of data, and I know the Vice Chair has brought this up in previous meetings, this is on our internal audit plan going forward. So that piece of work will be looked at to make sure that the data we're using is accurate and does give a valid representation of our operations across the local authority. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Obviously, the 3 recommendations you've just referred to, they were due to be completed by the 30th of April of this year, delayed due to the review of the corporate plan, which obviously is the 24-27 corporate plan. I read it this week for another meeting. But I'm just wondering, is there a likely completion date for those recommendations yet, or is it still work in progress?
I think it is work in progress, but obviously improving. And then in the new year, we will be looking to sign off our corporate performance management framework. So hopefully by the end of the financial year, we'll have far more robust service user perspective. I think that we have had the delay with the crossover of chief executives, and as you said, the delay of the corporate plan going through the adoption process.
Thank you. Any questions from any colleagues? There we are, in which case no hands showing. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is the Register of Regulators Reports and Recommendations, starting at page 315.
Thank you, Chair. So again, another standing item for the committee. So since we've last seen this report, there has been 4 national reports produced by Audit Wales. Council use of performance information, which I just alluded to, so all 22 local authorities on the service user perspective. There's also been a report around digital by design, which Neath Talbot Council did feature heavily in examples of good practice. That will be brought to you at Governance and Audit on the 21st of February. The following 2 national reports are around affordable housing and active travel. Both these reports had a number of Welsh Government recommendations included, and these have been passed to officers within social services and housing and environment and regeneration for them to note. The local report is around financial sustainability. Again, this was a thematic piece of work across local authorities in Wales. We have had feedback now on our Neath Talbot piece of work, and that will be brought to Governance and Audit on the 21st of February. And I think quite timely, it will also be brought alongside the All Wales Audit Wales report as well, so we can see the 2 pieces of work. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. Obviously, there's some very positive things reported in this document, and obviously the fact that a recommendation has been made following a thematic report is not unusual, but it'll be interesting to see what's brought back in February. I don't know, colleagues, if any of you have any questions. No?
Just for information, really, for committee members, we met with Alison Lewis this week, and for information, what we've agreed, I think, with yourself, Chair, as well, is that if any Audit Wales reports are published, national ones are published by them on their website, we won't wait until the next Governance and Audit Committee meeting, we'll send you an email with links to those published documents, so you'll see them as and when they get published on the Audit Wales website, and you won't have to wait until you get here to understand that they've actually been published. What you'll get here is a bit more of an understanding of how it impacts us as a local authority, but at least you'll have had sight of the report as and when it was published by them. So hopefully that'll just make things a little easier. Diolch.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and it is will be beneficial. I know obviously when we do then have our meeting, there's more meat put behind it. So when we get the email, it would be helpful if we just had a brief understanding of what your initial thoughts are with regard to the implications. Any questions from members? Obviously, this was for us to note the reports and the update of the regulators' reports and recommendations. So if there's no questions, we note and we'll move on. And agenda item 11 is the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales Annual Report 23-2024. Obviously, this was a document that wouldn't have been in front of us in October, but it now is, and it's quite an interesting read. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. So I'll just talk members through the basis of this report. It's now something that the Ombudsman Office produces on an annual basis, just to give some statistics of the matters of what have specifically been considered for Neath Talbot Council, and obviously how it compares then to the national average. It's been placed before our Cabinet a few weeks ago, and the Ombudsman requests that we also then place it before the Governance and Audit Committee as well. So just to give you a bit of a run through as to some of the issues specifically there, relating to the period 1st of April 23 to 31st of March 24, you will see that the 35 complaints were referred to the Ombudsman's Office in respect of Neath Talbot Council, slightly less than the 39 obviously from the previous year, with the council ranking 17th out of the 22 local authorities in Wales. What the complaint when it comes to the Ombudsman, our process will ultimately be is the Ombudsman will contact myself and will send me a copy of the complaint that's been received. I then have the opportunity to speak to our designated complaints officers in the individual directorates, who will provide the information for me to review then, and I act as the channel between the council and the Ombudsman. So it gives me an opportunity in my role as monitoring officer to be able to look at the nature of the complaints and see if there are any significant issues that ultimately have come out of them. For the most part, there are not many major issues. They tend to be more service specific issues. For example, some of the ones in related to planning, it'd be where the council has taken a decision to serve a planning enforcement notice and the recipient of that notice hasn't been too happy obviously that they've received it. So it's very much operational and smaller scale elements what it relates to. In some cases the matters are dismissed by the Ombudsman as saying that there's no been action on part of the council that they need to address. Sometimes what they will do is ask us to look at it again and perhaps have an independent officer undertake a fresh observation of that particular case. They call that an early intervention process, and it's something we always encourage and we work with the Ombudsman Office to achieve. And then ultimately it could have resolved the issue. So it never really changes perhaps the outcome of the initial complaint that led to the Ombudsman, but it gives that necessary assurance to the member of public that it has been considered again by a fresh pair of eyes and the way in which we take that forward. Interestingly, this year, the Ombudsman has included a new statistic in their figures, and that is the number of recommendations being complied within the timescale specified. And you'll note that in one of those figures, it's given an overarching element of the 14 recommendations to the council, only 29% were complied with. So I thought it'd be helpful just to give you a little bit of narrative as to what that relates to. So it's predominantly 4 or 5 individual cases which had a number of recommendations. So in respect of 2 of those early resolution cases, it was agreed we would conduct a detailed investigation, meeting with the complainant, and then obviously responding with them in a particular timescale. In that particular case, what happened was it took a much longer process to be able to conclude that investigation, to obviously to speak, to gather all of the evidence. And what happened was they'd agreed, the client officers in the Environment and Social Services Directorates had agreed to meet with those individuals, and we hadn't notified the Ombudsman that it was going to be slightly delayed in that sense before we could respond. So that's obviously the reason why then the Ombudsman had marked it down as being a delayed compliance. So I've put a new system in place now that if there is going to be a delay in respect of it, it will be notified to me, so that way then I can ultimately inform the Ombudsman Office and agree then any additional time. And then again in the other matters that I've referenced, the recommendations were complied with. We just hadn't actually forwarded a copy of our response confirming that it had been complied with back to the Ombudsman's office. So again, I've just updated our systems now to make sure that when complaints officers do respond, I also now get a copy so I can make sure that I'm forwarding it back onto the Ombudsman's office as well. So going forward, hopefully we're going to see that statistic now ultimately being improving to the extent that it should be. One of the other interesting elements that the Ombudsman Office letter includes is in respect of our standards regime. So this is something that does fall within the remit of the Council's Standards Committee, and it's something they have considered in detail. But again, just for you to see it for completeness sake, it covers off the number of complaints that have been referred against elected members of Neath Talbot Council, being just 8 ultimately for that year. All of those were ultimately dismissed bar 1, which was then referred back to our Standards Committee, and they considered that matter earlier this year. And that did involve a member suspension, but that suspension now has concluded and that member has returned to council duties. It also includes a reference to the work of the town and community councils and the complaints ultimately that we received there. So going forward, we always try to make sure that we are continually embedding improvement into our processes and the way in which we deal with complaints and the various different issues there. So we're doing ongoing training ultimately with complaints officers. We bring them together in various different forums to make sure there's a sharing of good practice. We are looking at ways ultimately to try and address issues more at the face of matters without it having to escalate through a complaints process. And we've also taken on board some of the Ombudsman's training and development opportunities that they provide so we can ensure consistency in the way in which we handle these matters. And then the Standards Committee have agreed a sort of vast programme of work which we are leading on at the moment to ensure that ethical behaviours and the code of conduct obligations are embedded in councillors' delivery of their work and are taken into account then in our decision making processes, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. And certainly the timescale issue that you mentioned, the 29%, was one of the things that I was going to raise, and it's obvious it's by omission rather than anything to do with commission. So a very full explanation. I did note, Craig, that on page 345 you've got the Town Community Council Appendix G information. Are those all the community and town councils that you would expect? Because Neath isn't on there.
No. What that basically means is there's been no complaint ultimately in respect of a Neath council member ultimately referred to the Ombudsman Office. So we have 16 town and community councils in the Neath Talbot area, all centred around Neath. Interestingly, though, when you look at those statistics, they reference, for example, Glengrach Community Council, but say they've had 0 cases ultimately referred to them. So I have picked that up with the Ombudsman's Office, and they have just confirmed to me it was a typo in their report.
That was really where I was coming from. If there are 0, you'd expect the 16 to be listed rather than just a selection of them. So yes, that's important. In the and it's on page 333. There's reference to Welsh Government giving the Ombudsman additional powers. And that's to include things including own initiative complaints. It's an interesting development. I don't know how long ago this was introduced or what you expect the implication of that to be.
Interestingly, yes, the actual PSOW was actually concluded an own initiative investigation, and Neath Talbot Council was one of the parties to that own initiative investigation in respect of the work that organisations undertake in respect of our unpaid carers. So a copy of the report and the recommendations that they've considered will soon be going to the Social Services Scrutiny Committee, and it will actually come back on your next agenda, Chair, in that sense, for you to see the recommendation and obviously the steps that the officers have put in place to address those recommendations as well. So that's the second of their own initiative investigations. We'll probably see more now as time goes on.
Thank you very much indeed. Does anybody have any questions? No. Obviously, this is for information, and therefore, with no questions, we note the report, and we'll move on to agenda item 12, which is the internal audit update report. And having said welcome to Steph Payne earlier, it's definitely welcome to Steph Payne now again. So Steph, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Chair, and good morning, committee. This is the first report for 24-25, and it confirms the position as at the end of October 24. So there's a lot in there for the first 6 months of the year. The committee report templates and formats have been maintained from previous reports. The reason for me doing this is to ensure no surprises approach for committee, especially with the change of audit lead mid-year. Now we have Appendix 1. This reflects a strong level of delivery from the team, including 24 audit outcomes across schools, National Fraud Initiative, audit and grant activities. We also have 13 post-audit reviews, and those are where we follow up audits that have had recommendations and ensure those recommendations have been implemented. Appendix 2 confirms a position against the approved plan, and at this stage there are no large-scale plan changes. As always, our plan remains risk-based and flexible, so you may see audits be deferred, new audit activity coming through during the year, and or audits being cancelled if other assurance streams are coming through, mainly to prevent audit duplication. Within Appendix 1, we have 4 limited assurance outcomes, and for each of these, a response from the Director or the Head of Service has been provided through Appendices 3 to 6, and this is to confirm the Council's position and direction of travel. For each of these areas, a post-audit review will be completed by our team, and those outcomes will be reported to committee too. Now, there are a few areas within that big report that I just wanted to highlight for committee's awareness. So 2 of them are where audits have been cancelled to date in year. The first is cybersecurity review. Now, this has been cancelled based on updated assurance mapping. The Audit Wales cybersecurity review is in progress at the moment, and that review will look at the National Cybersecurity Centre to 10 steps to cybersecurity. So it's over quite a big breadth of areas. Our approach is to keep in the loop regards the Audit Wales progress and outcomes, and what we will ensure is that the ICT internal audit theme is considered within risk-based internal audit planning 25-26. My goal is to ensure a higher amount of ICT, cybersecurity and data audit within our future plans. Another audit that has been cancelled to date is the Building Services Review, and again this is based on updated assurance mapping. For committee awareness, a 24-25 in-house service review is being led and is in progress under the Head of Property and Regeneration. Again, our service is being kept in the loop on progress and outcomes, and what we will do is consider that and then pull that updated risk assessment into next year's plan, most likely with a specific audit review rather than a general service review. So, for example, building services procurement. Another theme that has impacted quite a few of the audits within Appendix 2 is the Local Government Pay Award. So at the moment, we have Local Government Pay Award, Teachers Pay Award, and the earlier Christmas pay deadline being appropriately prioritised by the Council. Now, this will impact the progression of 3 audits in the short term, and that will be payroll, salary sacrifice scheme and overtime audits. We're working with the payroll team to ensure that we can conclude those audits as soon as possible, but fully support the prioritisation of payroll actions. Last but not least, I did want to pull up, not an anomaly, but something different within this report. Post-audit review completion, like I said, it's where we follow up audit recommendations and ensure that they have been implemented. On page 349, we have the Court Deputy Service post-audit review. The initial post-audit review has been completed, and what is unique is that we've scheduled a second post-audit review in April 2025, and that's to ensure that all recommendations have been implemented. The first review, we were at a midway point. There was a positive direction of travel, but not all recommendations had been actioned at that point, and the service are focusing on getting everything in place by year end. The Court Deputy Service Manager is in regular contact with our team to provide updates on that progression, and so the final outcome will come back to committee at year end. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I don't know if colleagues have any questions. I certainly have a few observations. Obviously, in the appendices, we've got the letters in response to the limited assurance status. I think certainly from my perspective as a chair, in the future, I would expect fuller responses. purely and simply because otherwise the last thing we would want is for a very short letter giving an explanation or some form of reassurance to come to the committee, only for us not to feel terribly reassured and then have to ask for it either to be redone or actually for the director to attend the meeting. I'm obviously not seeing the details of those letters until they are actually in the pack themselves. So I don't then have an opportunity to make any observations. And I know I've spoken with Steph as the audit manager about this recently, and you're going to give an explanation as to the timings and things at the start of those particular letters. But I would hate there to be even if it was a 2 or 3 month delay, purely and simply because what we're being given in the meeting isn't sufficient information.
Thank you, Chair, and that feedback is much welcomed. So if I take the report template point first, so welcome feedback on improvements that audit can make to what we present to committee. So what my goal will be for future committee reports is to add more detail within that template to provide context to committee. So we'll have original audit report date, the assurance rating, the number of recommendations raised, the recommendation implementation dates range, and also the post-audit review date, because I believe that will help provide context to the feedback coming through from the heads of service. The other point to raise is that those additions that are going to be made to the template, those do have an impact on the responses provided by the heads of service or directors. So in some cases, you may have an audit report that's been issued in October, for example, and then it comes straight through to committee within November. So it's a short time period. But what the goal is of those limited assurance appendices is to provide committee with assurance that audit recommendations have been considered, the risks have been considered, and that there is a positive direction of travel on the area before each area then gets a post-audit review. And that post-audit review is normally completed about 6 months after the original audit. So it's again to give committee that assurance that, yes, audit have made recommendations, but things are being done about them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. And obviously this is a really important part of our role to see the progress and things. There's reference in the paperwork, Steph, to the fact that obviously there has been, unfortunately, some lost days as a result of sick leave. I don't know if you want to brief members of the committee about that.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we have had sick leave, and what I have done, again, consistent in regard to report approach, is ensured that we do have an update on audit resourcing within the committee pack. So where we are, we have had change this year. We've had myself come through, and we have had ongoing sick leave within the team. However, what I can say at this point is the team has delivered a strong level of plan delivery to date. We're well underway to getting what we need done by year end and supporting the opinion and also supporting any feed through into the annual governance statement. So in regard to resources, where we've approached things is that sick leave and also the impact of me coming through as a new officer has mainly impacted our contingency budget. It hasn't impacted main plan delivery. What I will do is keep a watch on that throughout the year. And if that position changes, it's then my ownership to, one, identify if there's going to be an impact, and two, seek alternate potential resource as required to ensure we have appropriate plan delivery. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I know we've obviously mentioned training earlier in the meeting, but Steph and I attended a chair and vice chair's training event in Llandrindod Wells, beginning of October, I think it must have been. And in that there was a session about counter fraud and national fraud initiative. And they were asking us how aware were we of the organisation's counter fraud arrangements, what we understood. And so again, those are areas that I think because they are going to not just fall into this particular part of the paperwork, but also the strategic risk register. Those are areas that we would want to have some form of training on as soon as possible. I know that there's a big push by Welsh Government and others as far as national fraud initiatives are concerned. Does anybody else have any other points they want to raise?
Yeah, just one for me. I think we talked about this before, but for Appendix 2, I think if we can, I don't know, something you're thinking about, get some sort of visual representation of the plan, even like a pie chart or something to show deferred, not started, fieldwork, just gives you a kind of quicker view of how you're looking on the year. But yeah, good document though.
Thank you very much indeed. That's documents for information, and therefore we note the report. Oh, sorry, Councillor Clement Williams.
Thanks. Yeah, on page 350, mandatory training engineering services, it's gone up from 33% to 73.4%, but that's still over a quarter of staff that haven't had mandatory training, and I'm just saying that concerns me a bit. Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback. Where we are with mandatory training and where this originates from is the audit plan had a spot check approach per directorate to look at this area to assess the completion rate for specific teams. So it was very targeted. And with this one, and similar to the limited assurance appendices that are in this report and the feedback coming through from managers, the PAR reflects a positive direction of travel. Regard those completion rates, but based on those limited assurance feedback routes from heads of service and directors, those are now being reviewed and managed by relevant senior management teams for progression and to achieve that completion rate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Sorry, Nylwen.
Just to come in for information, really, for yourself, Councillor Williams, and the committee, we have implemented, and it's having a soft live rollout, our new learning management system for the authority. The previous platforms for staff to access all training modules and the mandatory e-learning modules was incredibly clunky, difficult to access. It was on more than one system, very difficult to pull the management information together, very laborious and onerous task for the team with Lynn Doyle. Thinky, that is the new learning management system, is a modern, up-to-date learning management platform that will make accessing those learning modules incredibly straightforward and easy for all staff, and will take away any excuses they might have had in terms of the clunkiness and the difficulties they would have previously had. And more importantly, or as importantly, I should say, it'll be much easier for us to have live management information. So every line manager, every head of service and director will be able to get up-to-date information with regards to where their staff are in the completion of those mandatory training modules and any other learning modules that have been identified in those members of staff's learning development plans. So I'm confident that that will help improve the situation as we move forward. Diolch, Cadeirydd.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Chair, can I come back briefly, please?
Yes, certainly.
So, I mean, who takes overall responsibility then when it's mandatory training? Who is ultimately responsible, and how do they know everything has been done to ensure the training is complete? But it's really good to hear Nylwen's update.
It starts with every member of staff taking ownership and accountability for completing those mandatory training models. Then you'd expect the line managers and heads of service and directors to ensure that they were giving the right messages out, and also it's important to ensure that the line managers are giving staff the time to complete those mandatory modules as well, not maybe expecting them to kind of do it in their own time potentially. So there's a role for line managers to play there to ensure the staff have the opportunity, have the necessary devices and access to those mandatory training modules. So ultimate responsibility, clearly, I've got corporate oversight of learning and development, but ultimately it comes down to every member of staff, every line manager taking their share of accountability. But like I said, I think the easier you make accessing that learning management system, the better our statistics will become in terms of completion rates on those mandatory training modules. Councillor Williams, diolch.
It sounds like you're on top of it, so that's great. Thank you.
And we'll have the ability to watch progress over the coming months as well. So thank you very much. Forgive me, Steph, I'd forgotten to mention about something which was referred to on page 289, the Mosaic system implementation for 24-25.
Thank you, Chair. And just to provide the brief background on that. So Mosaic is the new social services ICT system. This is due to go live in February, and this has been a very big project for the council in regard to breadth and remit. Now, where this comes through on our internal audit report is the fact that when the project board was set up for that Mosaic new system, internal audit were invited at the start to attend and have been able to attend those committees, be aware of risk discussions, general control discussions, and to act as a sounding board too. So we've been very, pleased with having that opportunity, and for going forward, we'd like more of those types of opportunities to be involved proactively with new systems, new projects. But going back to the original question, Mosaic is our new social service system due to go live in February and will impact a lot of service. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also think I'd better ask Nolwenn how you spell e-think, because I have no idea.
E-think or thinky?
Thinky. That's
now you're testing me, Chair. I think it's THINQI, but don't quote me on that. I'll have to check.
And there was me thinking it was a thought process instead of something different. So thank you very much indeed. Obviously, this is for information and therefore to note. And if no one else has any points, we'll move on to agenda item 13, which is the item about whether or not there are any urgent items to be discussed at my discretion. And I can confirm there are none. And therefore we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is agenda item 14, and this is about access to meetings. And it's the need for us to move into private session, and therefore I will propose that we move into private session. There are things that we need to discuss without the recording, and therefore I would like somebody to second this, and I will need somebody to verbally say they are seconding it.
Happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Grimshaw. We accept that. So we're moving into private session, and Nadine will confirm when that happens.
Just to confirm, the recording has been